Hello, and welcome back to Scouting the Cities in a more casual manner right now because the studio is getting work done. So we're going to leave it be. You get to see all our tapes and everything and our normal just house lights lighting. So it's pretty gorgeous, I'd have to say. Maybe not as gorgeous as when it's all done up with the lights and everything, but it's Scout Mason here for episode 6 of Scouting the Cities, and oh boy, do we got a good one. We are talking to Mike Grimm, the voice of the Minnesota Golden Gophers football and basketball on the radio. Mike Grimm, he's a legend, sportscaster of the year in multiple states, and boy, did he talk my ear off, and boy, did I love it. A great guest. You're going to hear a ton of different stories, but before we hear his stories, we'll hear mine. So here at the University of St. Thomas, where this studio is located, excuse me, bright and early in the morning right now, where the studio is located is the University of St. Thomas. I do play-by-play here, just like Mike Grimm does, or did back in the day at Luther College in Iowa, which you'll hear about. So I do play-by-play here for the University of St. Thomas women's hockey team, baseball, volleyball, anything, you name it, I did it. So at St. Thomas, my freshman year, we were a Division III team. So as soon as I could, I got behind the mic. Of course, it was 2020 COVID, so there were no sports in the fall, so I couldn't get behind the mic then, which was disappointing. But February 1st, boom, on the job. I don't know if I got behind the mic right on February 1st, but one of my first games, Division III hockey. I know I called one of the final, I think the final St. Thomas Tommy Johnny game, which is the University of St. Thomas versus St. John's University, a big rivalry here in Minnesota, of course. This is Scouting the Cities. You should know that, right? Or maybe I should be the one telling you, which I am right now. I called one of those final games. And since then, I've been in love with doing play-by-play. It's, one of my goals in life is to call the Stanley Cup final, become Doc Emmerich. Of course, hasn't really been replaced yet. Sean McDonough, he does a good job. We'll see if he does it this year. Of course, sadly, it is the Vegas Golden Knights versus the Florida Panthers. The Carolina Hurricanes lost. Very, very depressed about that one. So, play-by-play, I've seen a lot over the years. One of my favorite memories, of course, here in Minnesota, was calling a early-in-the-season softball game. So, during softball, we set up at the top of the bleachers, right behind all the parents, so they can hear me loud and clear. They like to give me little reactions if I'm saying something negative about their daughter. And so I'm at the top of the bleachers. It is cold. I'm wearing a parka in, what would it be, early or late March, early April. So I'm wearing a parka. It's cloudy. It's not looking good. And we get through probably about 4 innings. Of course, it's 7 innings in college softball. And all of a sudden, snow starts coming down all over our equipment. So that's not good because our equipment, can't get wet. And snow is wet. Of course, it's like a light snow, and then it starts picking up. It's pretty heavy snow. We're like, okay, time to move mid-game. So we have a cart that we carry up to the top of these bleachers. And now we have to carry it down the bleachers. So this is fun in the snow. So we start carrying it down. We have to unplug everything. And we go and move. We also only have one camera for this live stream. We move it under this small cart that is for like a press box for, our SID, our sports information directors who are, running social media, who are doing the live stats that go out. So we move this cart under there. I go under there. So we're also right next to the St. Thomas dugout. So our one camera is now right at field level, right at the fence. And shooting that way, and I'm under this tarp standing right next to the St. Thomas dugout. Now, luckily, St. Thomas softball, legendary, dominant. Of course, Coach Cheetah, I can't remember his first name, but Coach Cheetah, one of the best Division III softball coaches of all time. And so, yeah, we call the game, or I call the game from there. It was a wild moment. Since then, we've moved up to Division I, and now that one-camera softball shoot is 3, maybe 4 cameras. It's glorious. Of course, my buddy Tony Pasquazi was on the call this year while I handled baseball over on North Campus. And, yeah, so there's my play-by-play story, one of many. Of course, I've been doing it now for 3 full years, which is amazing. And I hope to live up to the level that Mr. Mike Grimm is at and get some of the stories that Mike Grimm has. Of course, you'll hear about one of the winningest coaches in MLB history. You'll hear about Minnesota legend Sid Hartman and much, much more. It's a great episode, and I hope you enjoy. So here it is. Mike Grimm, ladies and gentlemen, the voice of the Golden Gophers. All right, so Mike Grimm, welcome here to the University of St. Thomas. So you are the Minnesota Golden Gophers play-by-play announcer for football and basketball. Yeah. I guess, first off, just break down how that happened.
Good question. So it was, I had many years of radio experience, grew up in the state of Iowa, and so grew up in Big Ten country. Worked in the state of Iowa for about the first 9 years of my radio career, doing a bunch of different things. I did a year of play-by-play for the University of Iowa women's team. I did several years of the pre- and the post-game show for Iowa football. And from there went to St. Louis in 2001. And which, when you think 2001, you think, yeah, that's not that long ago, but that's 22 years ago now, or so. 22. And did a talk show there, and then was the pregame and postgame host for the St. Louis Cardinals, always with kind of an eye on wanting to get into the Big Ten as a play-by-play person. Yeah. This job here opened in 2006. When Learfield got the broadcasting rights, it became a split job. So one person was doing football, and then they needed someone to do basketball. And my wife is from here, and her family are all Gopher people. So I'm like, man, that's a good one to pursue, get into the Big Ten, do play-by-play, applied for it, was one of 4 finalists, and ended up getting the job. And now here we are. This fall will be my 18th season with the network, and started as the basketball play-by-play man in 2006, and then was football pre and post, and then in 2011 took over for both football and basketball.
Well, that's pretty outstanding. And the Gophers, big time school, especially here in the Midwest. Was the only D1 school here in Minnesota. So I read you were a baseball player at Luther College.
Yeah, so I went to school at a Division III school in Decorah, Iowa. It was about 90 minutes from my hometown. Played baseball there, like you're doing now. Although back then there was no internet and there were no such thing as a podcast. I worked at the student radio station there while I was a student. Worked for the student newspaper as a sports editor. Played baseball, got some job, studied job training, work study. That's the word I'm looking for, where you work but you don't get paid. It goes toward tuition within the sports communication staff. So had a fairly broad base of experience. Clearly the most important part of that was doing the games on the radio at the Luther College student station. So did football and basketball games throughout, and then, as you mentioned, played baseball. I ended up being a 2-year starter at Luther. My last 2 years, first year was a JV. They have a JV team. Luckily, they have a no-cut policy, so I didn't get cut. Stuck it out, ended up playing quite a bit my last 2.5 years.
Big hitter?
I wouldn't say a big hitter. I was a punch and Judy type hitter back then. I had some wheels, could play some defense, and I like to describe it as I was a pretty mediocre Division III baseball player on, at the time, a pretty mediocre Division III baseball team. So I fit right in.
There you go. Yeah. But not a mediocre announcer, I assume. So you were calling basketball and football there?
Yeah. And it was actually a really good experience because at that time, and I think it still happens, the basketball teams, the men and women play doubleheaders. So whenever they played, we would get 2 games. each night. And so back then it was a Friday, Saturday, almost like what college hockey is now, is what college basketball was then. And it still may be that way. I haven't tracked it that closely. So every Friday and Saturday night, we'd get, I say we, because I had several different fellow students who were broadcast partners within that. A couple of them are still in the business. I think I'm the only one that ended up staying on the air, though. The general manager of the radio network at Drake University in Des Moines was my main primary partner throughout our years at Luther. So he stayed in the business, and he oversees the radio network there at Drake, the Drake relays and all the marketing part there. But so we would get 4 games basically every weekend for 3. I started that as a freshman. So for basically almost 4 full seasons, we were getting a lot of games. So I don't know. By the time I graduated, I probably had 250 games of play-by-play, which was huge, because you get the reps, you get comfortable. Even now, I wouldn't say I get nervous, but I still am excited every time there's a start of a game. And back then it was probably more nervousness, but part of why you're excited but also relieved is you learn. You get comfortable in front of the microphone. You get comfortable with certain things in a football game. You get a feel for how the game goes, football and basketball both. You can make your mistakes with some relatively risk-free environment, because it wasn't a great deal of listeners on a student station.
You got your mom.
Got my mom, and again, even then there was no streaming, there was no internet. So I want to say that the station's KWLC, it's still there. But I think the range was maybe you'd had to be within 15 miles of campus to get it. Yeah. Now I can listen to it. If I want to listen or watch a Luther college football or baseball broadcast or basketball, I can just click on my phone. Back then there was none of that. This would have been 1990 through about 1993. So to listen, you legitimately had to be on or near campus. And so it wasn't there weren't a lot of listeners, but we did have listeners. I would get feedback oftentimes from fans in the city. You know who I got the most feedback was from the coaches' wives, because they wouldn't. Eventually, it got to the point where, because before I got there had been a long stretch where no games were broadcast, and then through just some happenstance and different things, I asked, hey, does a student station ever consider doing games? And the station manager was like, yeah, we used to, but we haven't had any students interested. So I'm like, well, I'm interested, and the rest is history. I remember, again, this is pre-cell phone too. I called her. I got the info that she was the person that would make the decision. I called her, and she said, well, what experience do you have? And
I play sports.
Yeah, and here's what I said, and it was the truth. And I was sincere in the answer, but she broke out laughing when I answered it this way. She said, well, what experience do you have? And I said, well, when I was growing up, I would watch a game on TV in the basement and broadcast it to myself.
That's awesome.
Which is true, and that was the extent of my experience. And she broke out laughing, and I didn't laugh. And then she realized, oh, he's this isn't a joke. He was serious that this was his experience. And so we the first game I did, I still know it. It was January 3rd, 1990. It was a Luther College, Wartburg College men's, women's basketball doubleheader my freshman year, which also coincides with the night so we did both games. My wife, who I didn't know even existed, my current wife, my only wife, but she wasn't my wife at the time, was what I'm saying. She didn't. I didn't even know who she was. She played in the game. She was on the women's team, and after the game, I'm going to really drag this story out now.
No, that's perfect.
The freshman dorms were closed, so I had to stay with a friend in the upper class dorms from my hometown. He was the point guard on the men's team, so which was great, because while I was there, I was able to get some info.
Yeah, you get to know the players a little bit.
Get to know him. I was asking, they were getting sick of me. Him and his roommate were getting sick of me, because I would ask about every player, so I'd have a basis of knowledge.
Yeah, of course.
When I went in, and it really, part of all those games, what it taught me was the art of preparation, because that's the key to the whole thing still today, is you got to go into a broadcast prepared. So to drag this story out a little further, that night I did 2 games. They had an adult. He was the local principal of the elementary school, but he had done some radio, and he was the public address announcer. So he came on and helped. And I remember distinctly after the game, he's like, holy cow, you're really good. And there's just some natural, I think you're born with it. You have some, it's like a pitcher in baseball where you can't teach a guy to throw 100. If a guy can throw 70, you might, through technique and workouts, get him to throw 80. but you're not going to get him to throw 100.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to suggest I'm the equivalent of a guy who throws 100, but there was some natural ability. And so from the very first time I opened the mic, it just kind of clicked. And then as you get those repetitions and that experience, you get better and you progress. So yeah, that was, and that started then this 4-year stretch of where classmates and I would do these games. And it got to the point where enough people listened, the basketball coaches, because we only did home games for the first year, basketball coaches said, there's probably more of a need for road games because people can come to the games.
Yeah.
But, if Luther's playing at Simpson, that's a 3-hour drive. And so the basketball teams would pay for a hotel and they would let us ride the bus. And so that was my first experience with traveling with the team, which that's what I do now with the Gophers. We, fly to most games. And so anyway, that's kind of how it all started. I think that was your question.
Yeah. Well, you know what?
It
answers something, right?
Yes.
Yeah. You're right about this student experience and play-by-play is invaluable. I do play-by-play here at St. Thomas. And
you were the lead guy, last week on the STAA?
Yeah.
Highlights, right?
I started that one off. Yeah.
I saw that.
Thank you.
Was it a robbing of a home run?
It was a
right?
robbery of a grand slam home run. Of course, we'd already given up 3 or 4 runs in the inning, but it ended the inning.
You were the leadoff highlight.
Yeah. That was awesome. Well, I'm glad you saw it.
I go through that. I like to watch each week, so I'm like, hey, I know that guy.
Yeah. Well, now you do. So,
I do.
No, you're right. That student experience is invaluable, especially here at St. Thomas. We started off as D3 my freshman year,
right?
Or we were D3 my freshman year. So first week of school. Well, it wasn't my first week of school. It was the first week of the second semester because COVID. We didn't have fall sports and everything. So spring semester, I start off with athletics, and my boss is like, "You want to call a game?" And I was like, "Yes, obviously I do." And I call a Division III hockey game against St. Thomas and Hamlin, I believe it was, and immediately got on the mic. And that experience is amazing. And now we're D1, and I'm still calling games. Of course, I got to do the women's game now instead of the men.
Yeah.
But it really is awesome to learn all that stuff, get comfortable on the mic.
It's key, all these reps. And I have a lot of people who will reach out and say, hey, I'm a student. Do you have some advice, or do you want to get together for lunch or Zoom? I've Zoomed with students before. And one of the things that I always hope to do is catch them when they're freshmen or sophomores to tell them just how important the student work is, whether it's student newspaper, student radio. Nowadays, there's podcasts, as you're doing. There's student work study within communications. There's marketing. There's all kinds of stuff you can do just to learn every facet you can if you want to be a sportscaster. And the whole industry has changed now. There's from when I started there, I would say there's fewer jobs play-by-play in radio, but there's more opportunity to do play-by-play because of streaming.
Yeah.
And that's great. And so, when I was in high school, none of our games were on the radio. My hometown at that time didn't even have a radio station. Now all the games are on radio, and all the college games are on streaming.
Yeah.
Whether it's for example, like at the Gophers, St. Thomas, similar. If it's not on over-the-air radio, it still is streamed. So oftentimes with video, which is even better. And so somebody it has to do that. So when students ask me, I hope I catch them early in their career, because there have been occasions where someone's like, "Hey, do you want to? I'd like to pick your brain a little bit." And I'll say, "Yeah." And they'll say, "I'm graduating in May, and this might be February." I'm like, "Okay, cool. Well, now's the time to start reaching out to any connections you have and find out if there's work someplace, even if it's freelance work to start or whatever." And sometimes I'll say, "What experience do you have?" And well, I don't have much, but this is what I want to do. And I'm like, man, you're a couple years behind. You have to start early. You have to get experience. Internships have dried up a little bit due to labor laws. A lot of stations forever and ever were able to take advantage of interns in terms of free labor.
Yeah.
I'm in favor of that, frankly. Any experience you get is good, but the labor laws, I don't know all the rules, but basically it's evaporated the internship because stations don't have budgets. Stations run on very thin margins. There's a lot of stations that don't make money. Small stations, and even big stations, the corporate ones really run on thin margins. So there's nothing in the budget to pay an intern, and so those things have dried up. So you have to create your own through the student station. Through there's like here in Minneapolis, in the Twin Cities, I should say, there's all kinds of games now, high school games that are streamed. And my suggestion to any college student that wants to get into broadcasting is go snag as many of those assignments as you can, because there's so many games now streamed, and it's a great service. I have nieces and nephews that play high school sports, and I don't have to. I mean, I love going and watching them when I can, but if I'm out of town or what have you, they're both playing lacrosse right now this season, and I can click on almost all their games are streamed.
Yeah,
and it's great, and they all need announcers, and so it's great experience. You might make $50 or $100 a night. All of a sudden, you do 2 or 3 games a week, and you're making more than I'm making.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And all that stuff is valuable experience, because you just never know who. One, you're learning. 2, you're meeting people. And so anyway, again, that's a long answer, but there's that's my suggestion is you got to get, all the experience you can, and
as many reps,
create all the networking opportunities you can. And then I also think the key is, once you're then working into the real world, is the art of networking. In other words, taking advantage of those relationships without making whoever you're trying to help you feel like that's what the point is, right?
Yeah.
There's a diplomacy to it, and the really skilled people end up working their way through the industry well.
Yeah, it is crazy, like, how everything is streamed. Like, I've done, like, some NA3HL games.
Right.
Like, and I'm sure people didn't even know about that league before,
Yeah,
right? But now it's all publicized because everyone's focusing on social media, and
No question.
the stream helps with that, right? So coming out of college in Luther, where did you go from there?
So an internship was exactly what got me my first job. I interned in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, which is a good-sized Iowa town, city. And at the time, it was it still is, it's a rated market. But I interned there between my junior, got to think about this, I interned there between my junior and senior year of college in the summertime. And again, I felt like I did good work. They seemed to like it enough to where they actually put me on the air doing some sportscast. And this would, as an equivalent, WMT radio in Cedar Rapids would be, for Eastern Iowa, what maybe a WCCO in its heyday was here in the Twin Cities. You're kind of the local news talk station of record. And that still is the case, but in this changing environment, it's a competitive market. And so I interned there at the sports department in the summer, heading into my senior year. Graduated in May, and there was a job there overnights. It wasn't sports. There was a talk show aspect to it. So I'm in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, my first job, and I'm hosting a talk show. I'm the only guy in the building from 10 p.m. until 4 a.m.
Oh, my.
But my show was 1 a.m. until 3 a.m. So I'm trying to take calls in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, from 1 to 3. No call screener. It was literally, hello, you're on the air.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And then you don't know
who it's going to be.
And sometimes it was drunk people calling in. Fridays were
like
always
most of the time it's drunk people.
At 1 a.m. on Friday, it was almost all drunk people, right? And they thought they thought they were funny, and I'd have to play along. But man, it was a great experience. I can't say it wasn't. Like, I wasn't dying to go to work every night, though, because it was hard, and I'm 22, so I have no world experience at the time. So there were smart people that would call into the show and try to embarrass the youngster, and they accomplished
and they would,
it.
yeah.
They accomplished it a few times, and they're like, "You don't know anything." I'm like, "You're right. I'm 22 years old. I'm making $1,000 a month, so piss off, man.
Yeah.
I mean, just let me do my job here." But so I did that for about 2 years. The best part for me was I was the fill-in sports guy. So if there were times where the sports guy was on vacation, I would do afternoon sports or morning sports. And then Friday night was my big night, because that was, again, this is pre-internet. So now, if you want to know what your high school football score was, in about 2 punches of your cell phone, you have the score.
Yeah.
Up to date. Like, third quarter, here's the score. Somehow you know how to find
You know the
it.
plays,
Back
too.
then, none of that, right? None of that. So the high school football scoreboard show was a big deal. On Friday night. So I hosted that for more than that, 4 or 5 years. Friday night at 10:30, it was called Prep Scores Report. And it was great because I was very organized with it. I would give scores by region and district and class and rankings, and it was, and so people knew when to be paying attention for their district and what scores.
Yeah.
And it was also a little bit of an ego boost, because the coaches would call in their scores, because again, there's no internet. So I'd be sitting there from about 8 o'clock, and me and then another guy, we had an intern who would answer the phones, because they you hit about 10 o'clock. The
Everyone's
phone's ringing
coming
off
in.
the
Yeah,
hook,
of course.
and it's, Comanche beat Belleville 21-10. And we'd write them down, and then I'd organize them. And then oftentimes it'd be coaches that would call. And the ego boost part of it was they'd call and say, man, you're doing great. We love listening. We're going to listen on the bus ride back home from our, so we can hear
That's
all the
the
other
best.
scores.
Yeah.
And so I created a pretty good network of coaches. And then pretty soon it got to where we kind of branched it out. We'd take some calls from coaches on the way home, or let's see, I'm trying to think. Now my memory is hazy because there wasn't, in 93, 94, 95, there weren't cell phones, or at least, you weren't sitting in a bus talking. So it must have been a coach that was at his home locker room would call from the school phone. But we would get coaches on, and yeah, it got to be a fun time. And that eventually led to my first play-by-play job. Was at that station. I had been there 4 or 5 years, and then I would do what we did is we did an area game because we had a big signal. So on Thursday night in Cedar Rapids, there were 7 schools that would share one stadium, and so Thursday they always had Thursday for football. So two of them, two of the high schools were private. They had their own field, so it would be 4 high schools shared one stadium. So 2 had to travel on the road. Every week. One played a Thursday night game and the other played a Friday night game at home. Kingston Stadium was the name of the stadium. So I would do the Kingston Stadium game on Thursday night, whoever played.
You do the play-by-play.
Do the play-by-play, and that was our Metro game of the week. And then on Friday, it was our area game of the week, and we'd pick a highlight game. And that's where the station made a lot of money. They'd go into these small towns, and, for $100 a spot or whatever it was, their sales guy would go in. And, I mean, if you have Iowa people listening, they'll recognize some of these towns. But if it was Mount Vernon against Solon, right, that game would make them several $1,000s on a Friday, which you normally wouldn't, from 7 o'clock till 10. That's not a profit-making night.
Yeah, no.
So we'd go into these towns, and, again, feel like $1 million. I had a buddy who was in the print business, so we'd print shirts. WMT game of the week, we'd walk in thinking we were
pros,
big time, and so I did that for several years as well.
Well, you kind of have to play it up, right? Act like you're a pro before you are.
It's that's an exact thing. So I had internships, back to the internship and the importance of it. When I was in college, I had all this experience at the student station, but I interned at WMT, which led to my first job. And then I also interned at WCCO Radio here in Minnesota. And being around pros and just observing, and I like to consider myself a sharp guy. I was smart then. I think I'm smart now. Although as I get older, I don't know. But I just watched how people, like, this is how you do your job. And I was around some really talented people at both those places. I mean, my CCO internship, I was around John Gordon, who did the Twins forever. John and I, we haven't stayed in touch as much since he retired, but all the way through, he would write me notes. This again before email. I'd get 4 or 5 letters a year from John, just in Cedar Rapids, and he'd say, "Hope things are going well," and I'd write him back. And then at WMT, the guy I grew up listening to Iowa games is a guy named Ron Gonder. He's still alive, and I had lunch with him last August. I'm hoping this summer to get down there and see him again, and he's in great health. But he was a voice of Iowa, along with others. That back then, when I was young, there were 4 or 5 different networks that originated Iowa games. So I worked with him. He was my boss for 8 years at WMT. So you work around a guy like that, nicest guy you'll ever meet. You're around John Gordon, great guy, helpful guy. And so my first job, this overnight job, I just went in and said, even if I don't always sound like a pro, I'm going to act like it.
Yeah.
And I know, what the behavior should be. And then once I got into the play-by-play, that again was kind of a gift. It was a natural gift. And so the second I started doing that, it was great.
Yeah, and picking up from those, like, legends, right?
Yeah.
I worked at a radio station last summer. I told you before we started on that free labor, of course, which was great. Right. But I worked with this guy, Mike Raley and Bruce Farrell. These guys are big names in North Carolina.
Absolutely.
Like Mike Raley is a guy I grew up listening to on the radio on the way to school. My dad would always play the morning news, and there's Mike Raley, and my dad was like, I've seen him in Bojangles, a few times or whatever.
Right.
Bojangles is a fast food restaurant.
Yeah,
I realize it's a North Carolina fast food restaurant. But anyway, so that professional experience you gain from them, just being around them is so important, and just hearing what they have to say, because they've been through it all, right?
Are you too young to remember Woody Durham, for example? He was the voice of North Carolina forever.
I know the name, but I don't.
He's passed away. His son, Wes, is the longtime voice of the Atlanta Falcons. He was at Georgia Tech for a while. He does ACC games. He did the Gopher Bowl game on ESPN.
I think that's how I know the Durham last name.
So Woody was I'll tell you a quick story with your North Carolina background you might appreciate. So Woody Durham was just a legendary. In fact, there's now Learfield and the National Sports Media Association have created an award every year that it's a lifetime achievement award to some college broadcaster. So it started, 4 or 5 years ago. My friend at Indiana, Don Fisher, was the first recipient. Gene Deckerhoff, he's a longtime Florida State guy, received that award a couple years ago. Joe Starkey, the announcer for Cal, has been there for 50 plus years. He is the most recent recipient. It's named after Woody Durham. That's how legendary Woody Durham from North Carolina is. So the Gopher basketball team is going to play in the NCAA tournament against Texas in Greensboro, North Carolina.
Of course.
And on the other side of the bracket is North Carolina and Duke are in separate. That's how they pot them now. So they're not in the same bracket.
Yeah, they never play them
but they're
against each
still
other,
in Greensboro. So it's sold out, and they have those open practices. So Minnesota's going to play Texas, and I'm walking into what's going to be our practice deal in about 15 minutes, and it's pretty full. And it's all Carolina fans. Were you a Carolina fan?
I grew up an NC State fan.
I figured you're Raleigh, right? So you're Wolfpack. Well, anyway, so Woody Durham, North Carolina's practicing. And this had to be about 2009-ish. Tubby was the coach for Minnesota. And there's this line of people down the bowels of the stadium, just a long line, had to be several hundred people waiting, and they all had programs and Sharpies. And I'm like, oh, the North Carolina players must be signing autographs, even though they should be practicing because this is their practice time. And we're walking down that tunnel, and as I turn, I look, and all the North Carolina players are practicing. I'm like, well, who is Roy Williams over here signing autographs? No, it was Woody Durham. The radio guy is so popular at North Carolina that hundreds of people are lined up, and he's just signing.
Yeah.
Hey, and his saying was, "Hey Woody," so it's "Hey Woody," and he's signing his name, and I'm thinking that is pretty cool.
That is amazing. I feel like I recognize the name, but I'm sure my dad will have some story about him. As well, right?
I'm sure, and he was absolutely legendary. But NC State, of course, they've had a long time guy. I'm trying to remember his name now. But he's been there forever.
He's great play-by-play guy as well. So then you get to Minnesota, right?
Yeah.
What first? You get this big-time job. I guess you'd worked for the St. Louis Rams and Cardinals before. Yes. Yep. So I guess, let's talk about that first.
Yeah.
You get that job. Yeah. That's huge coming out of Iowa at that time.
Yeah, I was so my rookie year in St. Louis was the same year Albert Pujols was a rookie.
Oh, wow.
2001. So I obviously he started with the team at the start of the season. I got hired in July, so I got dumped in there in the middle of the baseball season to do pre and post game. And I grew up a Cardinals fan, listening to KMOX. So in a weird way, you think about this, I worked at WMT Radio for 8 years for the guy I listened to do Iowa games. He was my boss.
Yep.
And then I went from there to St. Louis at KMOX, the station in the summertime, because they have this big booming signal, hits 40 states at night, Clear Channel. I would listen to Cardinals games at night, and Jack Buck and Mike Shannon were the longtime voices, and I grew up idolizing them. I ended up working with those guys in 2001. Now, I worked with Jack for only about 9 months until he passed away. He got really sick. But I worked with Mike Shannon my whole time. Mike just passed away in the last month. But, so this was 20 years ago. So working with the guy I grew up listening to Iowa games, then the guys I grew up listening to Cardinal games, worked with them. And then when I first got to Minnesota, we were on WCCO, the station that
you interned at.
That I interned at. John Gordon was there with the Twins, and then I got to know Ray Christensen, who at the time, way back, was the longtime Hall of Fame broadcaster. So got to know him when I got to town. So it's pretty unique that those kind of the three stations or three networks when I was, in the formative years, really had an impact on me. I got to work for all of them. So I get to St. Louis in Iowa, having grown up and lived it, and knowing pretty much all you needed to know about Iowa athletics, because when you're young and you grow up, and then hosting shows, I was kind of the authority on it. People trusted what I had to say. And having grown up listening to Cardinals games, when I got the St. Louis job, I thought, well, this will be much of the same. I know a lot about the Cardinals. But when you don't live it, like I lived the Iowa thing. I was from Iowa, lived there for 30 years. I was 30 years old when I moved to St. Louis. And quite frankly, the first year or two was a struggle because fans knew more than the announcer on the pregame show. And it kind of was almost like a throwback to when I first started in Cedar Rapids when I was doing the general talk show. Once we got on sports, I was golden.
And you could have that prep, that prep of knowledge that's like, you know where
you only know it because you live it.
You live there. Yeah,
you can't just drop it in.
Yeah.
I mean, you can study. And then the other thing is, a lot of times back then, it's much less now. Radio programmers back then thought calls were the driving force to gain listeners. So I took a lot of calls. Nowadays, if you listen to radio, there aren't many calls because research has shown that most people don't care what Tom in Apple Valley thinks. They want to know if you're a good host, they want to connect with the host. And so if you're good at that, people aren't taking calls. But I took a lot of calls, and there were there were times where I didn't know the answer to certain things only because I didn't grow up there. I didn't know but by the time I was done, I was fine. People thought I was good and everything. But so it was a struggle early, but it was cool to learn again under great people. Working with Jack Buck and Mike Shannon. I mean, Bob Costas got his start at KMOX Radio in the '70s and lived in St. Louis. He didn't work at the station, but he lived in St. Louis still, and he would occasionally come out to Busch Stadium and watch games, and was familiar with me because he would listen to KMOX. So I'm sitting at the ballpark, and all of a sudden I can distinctly remember, I don't remember what year, but I distinctly remember Costas walks in. We had met by that time a handful of times, and he had been on the show. He was a regular, I'm going to say once every couple of months he would come on the show. So we had that. But he comes into the ballpark, and he sits down next to me, and we have like this deep discussion because there was the threat of a baseball strike. And, this guy probably should have been commissioner of baseball at a time. And we're breaking it down. And he was talking about how it got brought up. He said, hey, I was listening to your discussion the other night on the strike, and I was driving home, and I waited in the driveway for the discussion to finish because I was really intrigued by your thoughts. Wow. And he goes, I thought you were right on. Your thoughts were right on. So that was a nice ego boost to hear from, maybe
Bob
the greatest
Costas,
sportscaster of his generation for sure. Just sitting there at Busch Stadium. He's, and then his son, Keith Costas, ended up being one of my interns.
Oh, wow.
There. Now he's with MLB Network in an off-air role. And I've not talked to him recently, but we stayed in touch a little bit. Great kid. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess so you're doing pre and post game. How did you develop your skills there? And I guess you already knew baseball pretty well, you knew baseball, you knew all sports. Yeah. So I guess how did you hone your skills and kind of figure it out? Just
by getting a comfort level, and then it kind of got to be a formula. There was certain things that I thought were non-negotiable for the post-game show. So my job was, so the game ends, and then Mike Shannon, Jack Buck, and the rest of the crew, Wayne Hagan worked there for a while. Joel Myers was there while I was there. There were others. Those guys would have about a 20-minute post-game show just themselves up in the booth. Yeah. While that was happening, I was in the clubhouse doing interviews. And so the two people that always talked first were the manager, who was Tony La Russa for the Cardinals, and then the starting pitcher that night. And it was a group. It wasn't just a one-on-one. But I would play that. So those two things would get played in their entirety. I just felt fans driving home from the game would want to hear the comments of the manager and the starting pitcher. And that's all I had time for because I had to be back, within time.
And that would go on your show after
and then
the 20 minutes.
Once the dudes upstairs signed off, basically it was a commercial. And then we had a basement studio at Busch Stadium. So I was just down the hallway from the
announcers
from the clubhouse. I'd do the interviews and stayed right downstairs, walk in, and it was set up not much dissimilar to this, microphone, a little mixing board, and then I would hook my recorder in and say, here, manager Tony La Russa talks about the Pirates beating his team tonight. Hit play. It was usually 4 to 8 minutes, so that killed 4 to 8 minutes. And then Cardinals pitcher Matt Morris said this. That was another 3 to 4 minutes. And then it was mostly calls after that, And if there were some weird decisions or odd things, we would discuss that. People always wanted to, blame the manager for everything. And there were times where I'd agree and say, yeah, that I didn't like that decision. And there were times where I'd stick up for the manager or the player or what have you. And the third base coach always seemed to be, a target in the sense that anytime a guy got thrown out at home, everyone wanted to know what he was doing.
Yeah.
Third base coach, I'm like, I prefer being risky. I think if you push the envelope and make the defense make a play, you're going to get thrown out at home, no doubt. But more often than not, I'll bet you that within reason, you can't send a guy when it's just total hopelessness. But anyway, so it kind of got to be a formula. And then out of season, the show was a full 2-hour show every night from 6 to 8. So in the NFL season, obviously at that time, that was the height of the Rams. That was one of my first assignments. In fact, I got there in July of 01. One of my first assignments was going to cover the Rams training camp in Macomb, Illinois, at Western Illinois, very first week of August. So I was only on the job a week or two and was stationed in Macomb for a while. That Rams team went to the Super Bowl.
Oh, wow. What was that team? That
was the Kurt Warner, Marshall Faulk, Torrey Holt, Isaac Bruce,
That's
Grant
crazy.
Wistrom. It was a great team. It was 14-2. Big favorites to win the Super Bowl.
And they lost, right?
And they lost to Tom Brady. It was Brady's first Super
first
Bowl.
one.
I mean, I think the Rams were a 14-point favorite. And remember, that was September, that was 9/11, was that September. So the Super Bowl got pushed back. There was all kinds of weird travel things. And the first Super Bowl that really had that high tightened security
was that one.
And
you were there.
I was there. That was pretty emotional. Halftime, that was in the Louisiana Superdome in New Orleans. We jumped in the KMOX SUV and drove from St. Louis, followed the Mississippi down. We didn't fly it. We drove it. Because, again, travel was still a little shaky at that point. It was easier to fly or to drive than fly, cheaper for sure. So we were down there for the week of the Super Bowl, and Tom Brady won the first of however many, 7, I guess, that weekend. And so that was my first, in the off season. It was a Rams town, man. It was, and then they were good for the next couple of years, and then it was a slow slide. And then I left in 06, and just before I left, Scott Linehan got hired. Mike Martz got fired. I did not cover any games that Scott Linehan coached, but in fact, I think he got hired in July or August, and I left in August of 06 to come up here.
Yeah, and I want to get to. I know your son sent me to ask about Tony La Russa, but I want to ask first. I think this is something I guess people think about a lot when they're judging their own play-by-play and post-game show guys is how much you use your own opinion.
Yeah.
And for pregame, postgame, a little bit more. Yeah. But how do you balance that, I guess, bias or however you want to call it, like saying what you think about a game?
This is my interpretation of how people probably conceive how your games go. I think they think I like the Gophers, that I want the Gophers to win, and I think that's good for any local announcer for a Division I team that they should have that feeling because you're announcing to that fan base. I think they'd probably say I was a homer, but I hope they think that I'm not just a hopeless homer. Like I'm not going to always pick the bright side of stuff. I think you could listen to almost any broadcast I've done, and there are times where you can hear my frustration with the Gophers or their coaches or what have you. Nothing malicious or outstanding in terms of being terribly negative, but also fair. I don't know what they were thinking there. You can't make that mistake if you want to win on the road in the Big Ten. I've used that line a million times, which is basically a way of saying I know this kid's trying hard, but that's a mistake. If you want to win this game, you can't make.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how I couch it usually because I watch them. I know how hard the coaches work. They're working 100 hours a week. Their job never stops. Now they're well compensated, so I don't feel sorry for them, but I understand how much they're pouring into it. It's their life. Players the same way. Players, though, they recover quicker than fans do because players are at practice the next day working.
Yeah.
And all they can do is move on, where fans, it stews. The loss, they're frustrated, so now it festers for a few days, or in football a full week. So I get that. But players they're resilient, they recover. They can't worry about the loss last week because if you're worrying about the loss last week, you're going to lose this week.
Yeah, and there's no chance to improve.
So there is a fine line. I'm not going to just totally just rip them, but I hope people when they listen can understand. Okay, yeah, he's frustrated, and I think people also it's gotten to be a little bit of a bit like it really isn't. I'm not like anti-reffing, but we'll have some fun with the officials, and I think
like
if you can't have some fun, I've never once in all my time suggested that the Gophers lost a game because of a ref. People always say that. Oh, when you say the ref missed the call, you think that's why they lost. No, I don't. But I look at it in a weird way. If a Gopher player or an opposing player in basketball, for example, misses a shot, I'm not going to ignore that because that's a major part of the story.
Yeah.
So Jones misses a shot, rebound to Smith. That's a part of the game. Most of the people listening aren't seeing it, so I'm their eyes. And to me, I think a lot of people get uncomfortable if I say something like, oh, they called it a block, it looked to be a charge, or, oh, that ball went out of bounds off of Purdue, they gave it to Minnesota. And they're like, oh, he's ripping the refs. No, I'm just reporting.
Saying what you see.
What I saw. People can interpret it that way. I've never once ever, if anyone can find at any point in 17 years of me doing games where I've ever once said that ref cost the Gophers the game, I'll give him my entire year's salary from that year.
There you go.
It just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Now, am I frustrated? Is it a hard job? Like the refereeing is, I watch some of the NBA playoffs. I'm not a big NBA guy, but I watch them. And those are the very best guys in the world. Full-time employees that train solely to be officials.
Yeah.
And they miss a lot of calls. That tells you how hard the job is. At the very best in the world are still just okay at it, right?
Yeah.
It's a hard job. It's one of the harder jobs. That said, it isn't the hardest job, right? I mean, to me, it's easier to determine if it's a block or charge than it is to make 7 threes in a row while there's a 7-foot guy with a hand in your face, or if you're a quarterback trying to escape a 6'4", 300-pound guy that runs a 4.5 40 who wants to kill you, and you have to throw an accurate pass to a guy that has world-class speed. That's harder than determining if it was a hold or not, or a face mask. So it's a hard job, and there's going to be missed calls, but I don't think, like if we're going to be a sports talk show host and rip the quarterback for a poor play,
you can rip the refs, or not rip.
I would say rip, but you can point out that, hey, that was a bad call.
Yeah,
it's a bad throw by this quarterback. What was he doing? Well, he had a 400-pound guy with that's an elite athlete chasing him. It's not that easy.
Yeah,
much like when a ref misses a call, it's not that easy.
Yeah,
and frankly, they get paid to make those hard.
Yeah.
Like in baseball, for example. I always hear it's a 90. Oh, they get 98% of them right, which is true, and it's a great percentage. Like calls at first base, they get 98% of those right. Well, I think I know baseball. I'd get 90% right for sure. Like the only ones that are really making their money on are the bang bang plays.
Yeah.
So how many of the bang bang plays do they get right? And it's probably about half, which is still great. Like we wouldn't get half, probably. So it is what it is. I have no ill will whatsoever. I umpired for a long time. I umpired a lot of high school baseball, helped pay my way through college, and so I am with them. But also, to me, there is a reporting aspect to the job, particularly for people who are listening on the radio that can't see it. And sometimes we're trying to have fun, and I think people misinterpret it. Even like I know most of those guys in basketball because we sit courtside at a lot of places.
So they'll
come
to
up,
you.
we'll fist bump, we'll joke. Sometimes they'll even look over, like they'll look at us, and I think they're asking like, did we get that? Did we get it right or not?
Yeah.
And I usually
got
don't.
The replay over there?
I usually don't say anything. Or on a rare occasion, one of the guys makes a call, and it's just not the right call. And his partner, they'll look over at us and kind of go, oh, man, all right, well, play on, here we go. So we all make mistakes. I mean, there's many times, like I said, I'm not going to say so-and-so missed a shot. I'm not going to skip that part. So if the ref misses a call, that has an impact on the game. Many times in a broadcast, people can hear me, and I'll say so-and-so made the shot. Oh, nope, check that. It wasn't him. It was this guy. We all make mistakes. It's a gain of 4. Oh, no, that was a gain of 6. Okay. It's caught. No, he dropped it.
Yeah,
we're all human.
You mentioned a lot in that story, the impact of the game, and what I've noticed a lot in play-by-play today, especially I watch a lot of hockey. So in the NHL, with the transition to ESPN and TNT, they focus a lot on building a story to the game. So pregame, this goalie. Mid-game, this goalie, it's throughout the whole game. How important do you think it is to build a story throughout a game?
I think it's important. I think TV especially it's important. Frankly, it's why I like radio better. It isn't like I've had a bunch of TV people come and say, hey, you want to come and do TV? If I had that, though, I don't know if I would take a lot of TV jobs. I've been around TV enough that it's really a producer's venue, so to speak. It's their... I've seen, we're at a Gopher basketball shoot-around, and the TV people are there, and they're doing their production meeting, and the producer is calling all the shots. This is at 1 p.m. for an 8 o'clock game, and the producer will say, okay, coming out of the first 4-minute media timeout in the first half, we're going to throw this graphic up, and it's going to, as you say, it's already a preordained story.
Yeah, of course.
We're going to talk about the fact that Ben Johnson was an assistant. Let's say it's a Minnesota-Nebraska game. Yeah. We're going to throw this graphic up. It's going to be a picture of Ben Johnson when he was an assistant coach at Nebraska. We're going to talk about that, which is a legitimate storyline.
Of course.
But we don't know how that first 4 minutes of the game is going to go. We might like in radio. I would never I would have that in my notes. I'd be prepared
of course.
discuss it. I'd go through and say, "Hey, Ben was here from here and here. He was an assistant for Tim Miles. That was after a stint at Northern Iowa, and then he came to Minnesota with Richard Pitino. We'd talk about the whole thing. He was here in Lincoln just a year. They were, I don't know, I'm making this up now, but they were, 15 and 15, whatever. I'd have it, but I'd pull it out of the holster, so to speak, when there was either a downtime or there was a relevant point at which it should be talked about. And so in radio, it's much more of the broadcasters telling the story, and as the game evolves. And then if the game rolls into a blowout, then you get into more ad libs and you get into more less play-by-play and kind of talk show mode. Spencer and I joke with that sometimes. Like, okay, we better get the ad libs out and have some fun here because this game's out of hand. Where TV, those meetings, it's like, okay, and then out of the second media timeout at the 8-minute mark, we're going to have this graphic, and the Williams Arena was built in 1928. We're going to do that and show a picture of it. And again, storyline, yes. Does it fit there? Don't know. Doesn't matter. TV has a graphic. They're going to use it. So, I have my prep boards are good-sized boards, and I have a great deal of notes. And when I first started, and this is part of the reps and getting practice and understanding, what the audience hopefully wants and what they can get. And so I would fill these pages with all kinds of info. And as the game went on, even if it didn't fit, because I worked hard, right, to get these notes ready, I would cram in as many notes as I can, or as I could, and even if it didn't fit any storyline, and just to get it in. And then after a while, I just decided we're going to let the broadcast breathe. And so I would say on my boards that I put together for each basketball game especially, if I get to half of what I've prepared, I've gotten a lot in. But I've just become more relaxed on it because I don't want – we have enough clutter
you don't want to
radio.
Fill it up.
I don't want to just fill it up with some stats or numbers. But when there's non-conference opponents, I always like to get a bunch of info on the school, the opposing coach, previous matchups, any connections. And then there's times and places to bring that up throughout the broadcast. And in preparing that board, these spotting boards, I guess I'd call them for lack of a better term. In football, they are called spotting boards. In basketball, I guess templates or whatever. And they all are the same. And then I fill it in for every game individually. And they're all new every game. I don't know, it takes 4 or 5 hours, I suppose, to fill those in over the course of time. I've recently just gone to, I do it the day of the game. I'll get to Williams Arena. If it's a 7 o'clock game, I'm at Williams Arena at 9 in the morning, 10 in the morning. And then I just sit in the media room and just bang it out, and have it ready. And I handwrite it because it's like the old days at Luther College, you have a final. You take notes by hand, it registers. And I know, and I can remember where I wrote it on the board. A lot of guys now have, with technology, they can subscribe to services that will just print out these boards.
Of course,
you have to do, it takes 30 seconds to print them, and that's all you got. Because I always have stats, hometown, height, high school, free throw percentage, points per game, rebounds per game, assists per game, career high, who it was against.
All handwritten.
And the board will have a blank spot for that, and then I will fill it in. And so I kind of call it my cheat sheet, and then my board also serves as my score sheet. In football, I do not keep stats. I have my laptop there with stats, so I can look down and say Tanner Morgan's 8 for 10, 200 yards, 2 touchdowns, interception. In basketball, I keep a running score of the game itself on one of my boards, and then a tally each player that when a player scores, I just put. It's a running score, so I can look immediately. If Dawson Garcia scores a basket, I put I'm calling it Dawson Garcia from 15. It's good. Dawson now with 14 tonight. He's averaging 16.
Yeah,
and then I have a running count, and I just count it. If he makes a 2-pointer, I put 2. If he makes another one, then I put 4. If it's a 3, then I put 7 and circle it, and then I can quickly look, and that's his third 3 of the night because I have it all in
circled.
A running score.
Yeah, okay.
And then I have two lines, one for first half and one for second half. So that way I can say he had 7 points in the first half. He's got 12 here in the second. So there's some ways to make it sound smooth. These cheat sheets have a lot of stuff, and if you do it right, hopefully people listen and don't even realize how much info they're getting.
Yeah, right.
And that it sounds natural. Mm-hmm. But I hope they also say, "Oh, that's an interesting tidbit." I hope they don't say, "Man, this guy's putting me to sleep with this stuff."
All these numbers,
all
right?
these numbers or all these facts. And then Spencer. The other thing I'd say is Spencer Tollickson's my broadcast partner, and I'm going to say we are 15 years in. Yeah, I think 15 together, and so we spend a lot of time together. We text almost every day, so we're good friends out of this, and it's good because we have a good rapport. We can tease each other on the air without
good.
Hurting each other's feelings, and we'll take some shots. And I hope people feel like that brings them into being part of the family, and they can be in on the joke, because there is that danger, quite frankly. I've listened to broadcasts before, and I'm sure I've done it before, where someone tells a joke, and if you don't if you don't feel like you're in on it, then it's even worse, because now you feel like you're being ostracized out of the group. So
you're
alienate. The point of trying to, if you're teasing each other on the air, is you're hoping that will bring people in to be part of the tease, so to speak. So while I'm giggling at Spencer, he's making fun of me, the listener's going to be like, yeah, Grimm, what are you talking about? And they too will feel part of the family. And I think we do an okay job with that. Certainly we're not perfect, but the reason I say that is I will have oftentimes, if I'm on campus, and because we're on radio, we're not easily recognized, which is also I'm good with that. But it's also sometimes I admit it's fun to say, hey, I like to listen to you on the air. Hey, are you the guy that does the Gophers? And that's kind of cool. At first, it was a little unsettling because people'd come up and they'd just start talking to you.
Yeah,
like they just start talking like they knew me, like they were my buddy, and I'd be like unsettled, not turned off, not mad, but just like, geez, this guy's a little forward. He like we're not. And
you're
then,
a target right now. Yeah.
Then I realized, well, that's a compliment, because he has listened to me so much. I'm his friend.
Yeah.
Even though I don't know him, mm-hmm. right? That's the way I look at it. Maybe I'm wrong, but someone comes, all of a sudden they're striking up conversation.
Yeah.
They're saying stuff like you would tell only a friend, mm-hmm. like whatever it is. And it was unsettling at first. I wasn't sure like how to respond to that. Like, man, what like, hold on a second. Now I totally welcome it, because it's an indication that person feels like he's part of the bit, part of the gig,
yeah.
right? Part of the family, part of the whatever we want to call it, the listeners, and he feels like I'm his friend. And mm-hmm. so if he feels that way, by golly, I'm going to try to be a friend back.
Yeah. So you've been doing this for a really long time.
Now you're making me feel old.
Yeah. So has there ever been a point where you aren't having fun?
I'm always grateful, because there's only so many of these jobs, right? And once someone gets one, they're going to keep it, mm-hmm. right? Like, I want to be here forever, because it's fun, it's great. That said, yes, there are times where it can be, it can wear you out. There have been a couple basketball seasons where all of a sudden, you're in this death march, and the Gophers have had a lot of these in the last 50, my whole time here, where they've had some good starts, they've had some good Januaries. And then things start falling apart, and then by the end, it's a death walk.
Yeah.
And so that can wear you out. And I try to still be thankful, and appreciative. I don't want to. It isn't like all of a sudden, like for even this last winter, right? The Gophers won 2 Big Ten games, and at one point I forget what the losing streak was, 11 or 12 straight, I think. Mm-hmm. And so all of a sudden you're driving to the airport, and you're getting ready to fly to Rutgers. I'm going to say I wasn't that looking forward that much to that trip, right? I mean and I did have to kind of kick my own behind and say, come on, man, this is why you put all this work into to get a job like this and prepare, is because you want to do this stuff. So I sometimes had to give my own wake up call. The other thing is, what do I have to be down about? The players. And the coaches are pouring their heart and soul into it. If they're not winning, it's not for lack of effort. It's not because they don't care. They do. So if they're going to work hard, I'm going to work hard, and I'm going to appreciate it. Now, as it turned out, that trip to Rutgers, the Gophers lost by 35. That was not a fun broadcast. Ben Johnson got his only technical foul of his career that night. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. Did that answer the question?
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
always
of course,
grateful.
yeah.
Like I think about how lucky I am. I'm going to Williams Arena. We have a great broadcast location. It's a great building. I hope more fans end up coming because when that thing's loud, it's a great place to watch a game. It's a great place to call a game as a broadcaster. And then other places that like the basketball, Purdue is an incredible home court environment that any fan should make a trip there just to
really
see it,
is
just to
unreal
experience.
there,
It's
yeah.
amazing. Illinois is good. The Breslin Center, and then in football, you're going to the Big House, the Horseshoe, Kinnick Stadium, Camp Randall. Nebraska is an awesome road trip. People ask,
that's all they got. Everyone in Nebraska's there.
People. Yeah, they always say it's the third largest city in Nebraska. On Saturday is the Memorial Stadium, and as crazy as Nebraska fans are on social media, they're almost intolerable. They are awesome in person.
Yeah.
I mean, the tailgate people will invite you in, even if you have opposing colors on. They're very hospitable. The staff at the press box, the radio area, is unbelievable, welcoming. What can we get you? Can we do anything for you? So it's a great place. Like people say, if you were a Gopher fan for football, what road trip would you take? And I'd say if you haven't been to Lincoln, go watch Minnesota play in Lincoln. The good news is the Gophers have won there quite a bit in recent years.
Yeah.
But two, it's just a cool experience. The stadium is full, and Nebraska has had some down years, and it's still full. And so that's one of them. So occasionally I'll have to remind myself that you're pretty lucky. Don't be like, got to go to Rutgers, or we got to fly out to Purdue or whatever. I consider myself pretty lucky.
Yeah. So what do you think the best game you've ever called is?
Technically, or the most fun?
How about both?
Okay, so I think technically the best game I've called was the Penn State football game in 2019 when the Gophers were undefeated. Penn State was undefeated. Minnesota won that game. And I don't have a lot of time between my two jobs. If I had one thing professionally that I think I should do more that I don't is listen to the game that I did, for a number of reasons. One, you can find out if you did well or not, and two, you don't want to fall into habits of crutch phrases or annoying things that you do because they're annoying because you do them a lot, and you wouldn't do them a lot if you consciously
yourself.
were
Yeah,
doing
of
it, right?
course.
So I wish I could listen to more of my games, but football season is so busy for a number of reasons. So I honestly, I haven't gone back and listened to a lot of games. I did. It was kind of weird because COVID hit. So that game was 2019. COVID hit that following spring, and then as part of just frankly capturing some revenue that they weren't sure they were going to get, the Gophers rebroadcast some of those games, and so that Penn State game was one of them. So I happened to be home and I clicked it on to listen, and it was the first time I had listened to ourselves in a while, and I'm like, man. One, it was a big game. I do think our engineer is very good. He can make the sound of the game sound big.
Add the natural sound.
It was sold out.
Yeah.
The way he mixes the game, and it sounded like a big game. And I think we nailed most of it. Even stuff that probably people don't pay attention to of a predictive nature. Where I had a call like that against in the Iowa game this past year, where the Gophers weren't getting a lot of pass rush. And if you go back and listen to the call, I said, this would be a great time for a sack. Here's the snap. Here comes the corner blitz. Terrell Smith with the sack. It was all in one sentence. And
That's
so
beautiful.
it sounds great, right? And I don't know if people pay attention. I did. I thought it was great.
Yeah.
So, but that Penn State game, I think, was technically and just in terms of sound.
Yeah, of course. Was that at home?
It was at home, and so there was a great sellout crowd. Probably the most recognizable call I've had in my time here was the first touchdown of that game was to Rashad Bateman. It was a long play, I think 68 yards, and it was a spur of the moment. I did not have it scripted as he's getting to the goal line because it was such a big game. Both teams were 8-0, ranked in the top 10. And the place was going crazy,
Nuts,
and and it just popped into my head. It was mostly an original line. I had heard a version of it said elsewhere years before, so it wasn't like I totally pilfered the line. But I just said, he's to the, to the 20, to the 15, 10, the place has gone nuclear.
Yeah.
And it just popped into my head. And so I'll still have people, if they
Say
see
that
me,
to
say
you.
that was awesome. And they'll go for social media when the anniversary of that game, or if they have the top 10 plays or whatever, they'll use that call. So that's probably the one that I've heard the most about. And it was a spur of the moment, unscripted thing, and it just came out. And in fact, if you really want to know the truth, after I said it, I even thought, gosh, I wonder if that's going to offend people, because you just don't know what's going to offend people.
Yeah.
It didn't. People seemed to enjoy it. So I think that game technically was the best game, the best sound that we've had.
That game, I said that I was going to go to St. Thomas, and I was at a hockey tournament in Greensboro, North Carolina. Like you talked earlier, I was in Hopsburger Bar. And I remember it was like almost like an omen that undefeated U of M, of course I go to St. Thomas, but it's undefeated U of M against undefeated Penn State. And while I'm having lunch during this hockey tournament, I see this whole entire game. Of course, no audio or anything. We're in a sports bar, but I for some reason remember that game specifically, because I was like, wow, Minnesota, like they're good. Like this is going to be fun.
It was a great day. And the other thing that capped it off for me was Darryl Thompson, one of the all-time great people. Up until this year was the all-time leading rusher in Gopher history. He's my broadcast partner up in the booth. We have Justin Gard on the field and Tanner Hoops and others involved in the broadcast. But to see Darryl, who has been associated with the program since his playing days in the late 80s, the smile on his face after the game, just to knowing that he's a piece of that program. He was so happy. His son was on that team as a backup wide receiver. He was so happy. So it was just a heck of a day and enjoyable. So when they replayed that broadcast months later during COVID, and people listened, and it was really, I hadn't really gone back and listened. I was proud of that body of work for that game, quite honestly. In terms of the one I've enjoyed the most, that's certainly that Penn State game's up there. But believe it or not, I think my favorite game is I'm gonna cheat a little bit and say it's a two-part situation, and that is the first Gopher over Badger game in 2018. Late in that year, the Gophers had struggled early in 2018. They needed that win to get to bowl eligibility. But to me, the bigger thing was they hadn't won the Axe in 15 years. I had never in person
seen
it. And at that point, I guess I had been here. That would have been my 13th year, and 12th or 13th year. And to see it, and then the fun part was the Gophers put it away in late third quarter. They were not going to lose that game. So to not be nervous or on edge, just to be able to roll through that fourth quarter, knowing what was going to happen, that they were going to charge the end zone and get that axe. And then they kind of poured it on. They got a couple of late touchdowns, and really, I forget, it was 31-16 or something like that. They controlled the game. That, again, just created joy, because almost in a weird psychotic way, you got something that you wanted so bad. And when you're denied something 15 years in a row, it's like Christmas and any other holiday you want all rolled up into one. In fact, to the point where it was celebrated so much by Minnesota, the Wisconsin people who had won it 15 years in a row had kind of started to take it for granted. And they were like, what is the big deal? These Gopher fans are crazy. And I think now that Minnesota's won it 3 of the last 5 years, the Wisconsin people are now like, okay, we want this thing back.
Yeah.
You can't take it for granted. And then the secondary part of that was the Gophers then in 21 won it at home. They had not won it at home, I want to say, since like 93, something like that. It was early. They had not won it. They had not won it in Madison since 93. So in 18, not only had they not won it in 15 years, they hadn't won in Madison since like 93.
For a long,
They hadn't won it at home. They had never won it at Huntington Bank Stadium, TCF Bank Stadium. They had won it at the Metrodome in the early 2000s. 03 maybe was the last time.
Before your time.
So it was before I got to town. And so to win it on the home turf, and that rivalry is so big, and rivalry trophies create such a more intoxicating piece of the rivalry to me. and then to have the student section rush the field, and then to have everybody else rush the field. And then they did the typical Minnesota thing. Usually Minnesotans are uncomfortable really getting too crazy about celebrating anything, right? They've got this stoic Scandinavian background where we can't be too. It's part of why some people, I think, don't appreciate PJ Fleck, because he's so verbose and so optimistic. It's just for some stoic Minnesotans, that's too much.
Too much, yeah.
And I get it. I'm not, I don't hold that against anybody. But what looked like it was going to be this typical stoic, we can't get too crazy. The students are on the field, everyone's going crazy, and Jamie Verbrugge is the public address announcer. And we're on our post-game show, and we can hear in the background Jamie gets on the microphone for the student, or for the in-house in the PA.
The PA, yeah.
And he says, "Ladies and gentlemen," in his great voice, he says, "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please?" And everyone is just waiting for the stodgy Minnesota, "Please leave the field. This is too dangerous. Don't do this stuff." And so he says, "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please?" And everyone's like, "Oh, here we go." And all of a sudden, the first few lines of "Jump Around" play, which is, of course, Wisconsin's song. And,
that is awesome.
And in music history, that song isn't going to go down as one of the all-time classic musical tunes. However, the the lead in, is as recognizable as it comes,
anything,
right?
Yeah.
I mean, that, and everyone was like, "Holy crap, they're going to let us." They're going to let us celebrate.
We're partying. Yeah.
And so now it's and I know some people were also turned off. Like, why are you playing their song? Why are you wanting to troll them? Don't give them the benefit. And I don't think it was about trying to make them feel bad. It just made everyone. To me, I loved it because it just, one, I think the song's cool, and then two, to see your own fan base, and it was full on the field, and they're all jumping up and down.
Yeah.
That was
a fun moment.
It was a fun moment. It probably rubbed Wisconsin the wrong way, but that's the way a rivalry is.
That's sports.
That's sports, and
you gotta have fun with it sometimes.
And so they win it at home, and so those two, the combination of those two, and then of course this past year the Gophers won again. They won it in Madison again, so it's become a rivalry, and I think Wisconsin fans are now starting to feel we do want this thing back, and that's healthy. That's beautiful, and they made, I think, a good hire in football, and we'll see where Luke Fickell takes them, and I think PJ Fleck is on the cusp of hopefully taking that next step as well, to where you can get into some serious high level football here, because he's been on the cusp, including this past year, of trying to win that division. Now, technically, he has a division championship. He was a co-champion in 2019, but Wisconsin won the tiebreaker. But there is a trophy at the football building that says they're the division champion, along with Wisconsin. As hollow as that might be, I still think, so he does have a championship, but he's not been in that championship game. Yes. And that's the next step. But anyway, that's a long answer as always. You get long answers from me. But my favorite, I think, technical game, and it's a very close second to that Wisconsin experience, is that Penn State game. I think we called a really nice game, Darrell and Guardsy and the gang. But in terms of just pure, this is awesome, those two Wisconsin games for sure.
Of course.
Yeah, no doubt. And then early, it was my second year. Go friends, remember this. At the Big Ten tournament, Minnesota was playing basketball against Indiana, and they had a lead the whole time. It was a good Indiana team with DJ White and Eric Gordon, and Dan Dockich was an interim coach because Kelvin Sampson had been let go earlier that year. And the Gophers had Tubby Smith coaching. They led almost the whole game, and then through a variety of kind of snafus and offensive rebounds by Indiana, the Gophers ended up being down by a point with a second to go. Mm-hmm. And they threw a length of the court pass to Blake Hoffarber. He makes the catch, makes the shot. And I was losing my voice previous to that. I had a cough and a cold, so I'm not thrilled at all with the call. We went nuts. Kevin Lynch at the time was my partner, and he's screaming, and I'm screaming. I'm losing my voice. But that was a pretty cool moment. Hoffarber was one of my all-time favorites, and we still talk. He comes to some games, and we'll have him on at halftime on occasion. And but that was a fun moment, probably my most fun basketball moment, although I'm not thrilled with how the call went. Mostly because my voice was shot, and so I had to try to control it, and Lynch was going nuts because he was a former player. And so I think people thought the call was okay. I wasn't terribly.
I'm sure you're overthinking it though,
yeah,
right?
Probably,
Yeah.
probably. But if you go back and listen, I think you'd be like, yeah, I can tell your voice is not great, and you guys lost your minds a little bit. But it was a moment that called for it. So
yeah. So you have talked and I'm sure been around a lot of players and coaches. Any of them that stand out?
All kinds of them. I'll say this about. We'll start with my time with Minnesota here. And there are reasons to be critical of the NCAA and the the cynicism of big time college athletics and the money and what's it all about. And I think there's good reason for some of that sentiment. But I will say this, at Minnesota, being around these student athletes, now I got here, I was 36, so I felt like I was relatively young. I'm 52 now, so it's been a time. And each year I get older, I feel more energized by being around these young people that are achievers, that want to play, that are almost always good-natured. Of course, as we all do, we get in our moods on occasion. The football program is, no pun intended, because PJ likes to use the word, they've been elite at recruiting high-level student athletes that are good people and want to help and want to be nice guys. And if they mess up and recruit guys that don't fit that mode, it doesn't take long for those guys to realize they're an outlier and they're going to get out of town. Like the transfer portal has been good for PJ Fleck. It's definitely a net positive in the sense that they've gotten more good players than they've lost good players. Now, they've lost a few. Bucky Irving to Oregon probably would have been a difference maker had he stayed at Minnesota last year, right?
Yeah.
In a couple of those games where he could have spelled Muhammad Ibrahim, particularly the Purdue game where Mo missed. But part of the benefit of that is in PJ's situation, he runs a unique program, and if you're not in on it, like if you don't get it or you don't want to be fed that message, and PJ's talked about not being for everybody, it's probably best to go find a better fit. And in the old days, sometimes that meant, you had to sit out a year. I'm not going to do that. Mm-hmm. So I think the portal has helped because now he's accumulated a roster that is almost all full of buy-ins. Yeah. And that can help you win games. I don't care.
Huge,
It can help you win games. So from that standpoint, there aren't very many guys or players that I don't want to be around or don't want to interview. The hockey program was great. I really jumped on that bandwagon this year. I got to go down to Tampa for the finals, did some programming there. Didn't do the play-by-play, of course, but did some stuff. And then was in Fargo for the regionals. And it was, tried to get to Mariucci whenever I could when basketball didn't conflict. So that that group's been great. Ben Johnson's awesome. All the coaches over my time haven't had any guys that were really not cooperative. They've all been good. I think high quality people. So that's a general answer. And if I start naming names of Gophers, I'm going to leave some out. I always say, this is a Tony La Russa line, by the way. I always say, people say, well, who's your favorite athlete? And I'm saying, any list, it's going to include 30. I've been here a long time, and they're going to be tied for first, and then there's going to be a next tier of 100 that'll be tied for second. And then, and very at the bottom, there's a few guys that, hey, they didn't fit and they moved on. But by and large, it's been a really fun opportunity to chat with those guys. In St. Louis, Kurt Warner was awesome, the quarterback. Now, he and I played against each other in high school. We were both from Iowa. We played in the same conference. My claim to fame with him was I doubled over his head in a baseball game.
Yeah.
His claim to fame.
Had to give you a little bit.
Yeah. And his claim to fame outside of football was that he, in our conference, it was the old WAMAC conference in Iowa. He was the I got to remember, he was the leading rebounder. He was only 6'4", I want to say, but he was a leading rebounder and the second leading scorer in our conference in basketball. So I think he kind of had this reputation as kind of a slow-footed quarterback that wasn't a great athlete but had a great arm and a good mind. But he was a pretty good athlete, too.
Yeah.
He was a three-sport guy. Might have been four. He might have done track. I did not do track, but he might have even done track. So Warner was great with the Rams. There were some other good guys with the Rams. Cardinals had a lot of good dudes. And then you knew, there were some cantankerous guys, and that's to be expected when you have a room of 50 people.
Yeah.
They're not all going to be – and certainly the media at times can portray or tell a story that they don't want. sometimes in talk show, as we talked about earlier, might not even be based in fact. So I can see why there's some animosity towards media members sometimes, particularly with pro athletes. And so there were some guys that you just knew to avoid. Pujols was an interesting guy in covering him because he was great for the community. He did a lot of things for charity. He was the hardest worker on the team. I coached, my son Jacob. I coached him in baseball. Me and another guy and his group of people. Isaac was part of that over the years. St. Thomas guy here. So when I coached, one of the messages I always told those guys is when I covered the Cardinals, the best player on the team was Albert Pujols. He was also, though, the hardest worker on the team. He was the guy that stayed late and got in a weight room workout or hit off the tee for an extra hour after a game until midnight, or he was the first guy at the ballpark at 3. So when the best player on the team is also the hardest worker, that drags everybody else with him. And the 5-year run I had in St. Louis, the Cardinals were really good. They went to the World Series in 2004. They were in the playoffs all but 1 year. And they had a lot of good guys. David Eckstein was a shortstop who was just a sweetheart of a guy. And again, I'll start naming names. Darryl Kyle, the late Darryl Kyle, was always thoughtful with his answers. Jim Edmonds, who now does their games on TV as a color commentator, just rattling off a few names.
Yeah.
And then there were some others that, and back to Pujols, he was always friendly, always generous with his time with the media. But there were also times where we knew, okay, Albert's in a mood. He's competitive.
Fine, yeah.
We'll let him be tonight, and that's to be expected, right? I mean, I always liken it like this, because the media can certainly be the enemy to a player at times. And then I hear from fans who will say, why didn't you ask harder questions? Or this was, you threw Ben a bunch of softballs. Or, man, I listened to the PJ Fleck show and you didn't ask him about, how terrible the offense was last week. And one, the show's called the PJ Fleck show. It's his show, so I'm not going to just grill him. That said, I think we're fair. I think we ask him some hard questions. I know for a fact there have been times where we've left that show where PJ's not been thrilled with me because I've asked him a question that was maybe put either decision-making or whatever in a negative light. And he's been awesome. He's one of the most cooperative coaches I've ever dealt with. So I like that. But on the flip side then, I always liken it to this. I understand if they want to get mad, I get it. It'd be like Joe, the insurance salesman, just a guy. Mm-hmm. And he's out trying to sell insurance policies to you and me and your neighbor and his buddy. And at the end of the day, I'm going to walk up to Joe and say, Joe, why didn't you sell that policy to 1621 Main Street?
Yeah.
And then he has to answer. No, he doesn't want to answer.
Yeah.
So I see why a player, baseball particularly, 162 of those things. And you got a bunch of geeks like us standing there with mics in the face. How come you struck out with the bases loaded?
Yeah.
Well, I wasn't trying, So I get why there's some friction at times, but there also is a responsibility at times with the media that they have to hold accountable, players and coaches and front office and all of that. So there is that fine line. But to answer the question, I felt pretty lucky. La Russa probably was the most fascinating guy. For much of my radio career, he's probably the guy I interviewed the most. I think probably Tubby and PJ now, just due to longevity and number of games, are probably the two guys I've talked to the most now. And Patino, I suppose, would fit in there because he was here for a good time. And he's he might be my favorite, Richard, in terms of just dealing with, he was a smart aleck, I'm a smart aleck. We would tease each other. We had a real,
good rapport.
And he was pretty self-deprecating. He analyzed stuff. He wasn't shy about, saying, yeah, we messed that up, or we got to be better here. Or, I wish you would have done it this way. Or if fans were critical, he would also say, look, they can be that way, but I'm firm with what I believe. I think this is the way we did this the right way. It just didn't work or whatever. So, but I loved Richard. I still will occasionally text every now and then, and he's got a great sense of humor. But La Russa probably is the most intriguing guy because I grew up a Cardinals fan, as I mentioned, went into St. Louis. And La Russa, to me, he started in, 96? I got there in 2001. They hadn't won at a high level yet. They had a couple of good years. And he was always kind of the guy that people thought was kind of the snobbish, I invented the game kind of a guy. Mm-hmm. And I found him to be totally the opposite in the sense that he was genuine. He always gave thoughtful answers. Frankly, I thought he was a little insecure, which to combat the insecurity, this is my psychoanalysis of him. he was always great with me, in that he was insecure, and so he would counter the insecurity, I'm sorry, with this kind of almost false bravado, like this machoism that sometimes rubbed people the wrong way. But in my time around him, I took that to he's just trying to create this front because he himself is not sure, but he wants to, even for the team and for the fans' sake, this is how it is.
Yeah.
This is how baseball is played. And I think there were times where he just wasn't sure. You got to remember, he started as a manager, I want to say he was maybe 33, 32 when he was hired by the White Sox way back when. He told me this great story one time that Carlton Fisk, remember the famed Red Sox catcher,
yeah.
he finished his career in Chicago with the White Sox. And he was, if not older than La Russa, the same age or right in that same age. So this guy's a Hall of Fame catcher, or close to it. I think he's in the Hall of Fame. If not, he's borderline Hall of Fame.
He's got to be Hall of Fame.
Had a great career, and comes in to Chicago, and all of a sudden there's a manager that's younger than him or close to younger than him, and trying to tell him what to do. And so there was some friction early, and then he batted him in the 2-hole. And at that time, the 2-hole now is different, but back then the 2-hole was for the guy that could bunt. Because the leadoff guy is going to get on.
Base,
there was a lot more bunting back then. This is before analytics proved that the bunt stinks. Very, very few
works
times.
Works in college ball still.
It works in softball for sure because it's a different game. And I think there are situations that the bunt is called for, but the analytics show you should almost never give up an out on purpose, right? You're better off not doing that. I think if there's guys on first and second, no outs late in the game in a one-run game, bunt's perfect. That's a great time. One of the few times. Bunt, you got now the go-ahead run at second, tying run, got one out, chance for a couple hits. Otherwise, don't give up outs. Just don't give up outs. Even the other night, the Twins were at the Dodgers, and they bunted the catcher Jeffers, and they scored one run, but it became the second out of the inning, and they didn't get any more. They had 2 runners on base. I think you let the guy swing there. I think the analytics would have shown that, but I think they were desperate to get a run and get the lead. As it turned out, they won the game, so it was fine. Anyway, La Russa and it would
puts Fisk at
Fisk
two.
at the 2-hole. And at that point, at that time in baseball, the 2-hole was considered. I hit in the 2-hole often because I could handle the bat. I was not a power hitter. I could run a little bit, and if the leadoff guy got on, I could bunt. I could handle the bat. I didn't take it. I took it as I'm helping the team here.
Yeah.
Carlton Fisk is like, screw this. Like, I'm power
Carlton
hitter.
Fisk.
I'm Carlton Fisk. Like, I'm not a guy. And La Russa had to explain to him that Harold Baines is hitting third. Hall of Famer Harold Baines is hitting third. And I forget who the leadoff hitter, maybe Ron LaFleur, who was one of the faster guys. He's like, if LaFleur gets on in front of you, they don't want to walk you. Now they got first and second with one of the great DHs of all time, Harold Baines, on deck. They don't want to throw a lot of pitches in the dirt because LaFleur could steal.
Yep.
Guess what you're going to see? A boatload of fastballs, dude. Like, I want a guy with some pop in the 2-hole in this particular lineup because Baines is on deck, and they're not gonna walk you, so you're gonna get pitches to hit. And so he still didn't buy in. After a while, all of a sudden he had a nice year. One of his better years, and he's like, dang, you're onto something.
Yeah.
So it took a minute, and it's something. So La Russa was kind of ahead of his time on some of those things, and he basically invented the closer with Eckersley. As much as maybe we still to this day, some of us are like, man, closer might be an overrated role. If you have a good one, it matters. And he kind of created that because before that time it was guys would do 3 innings. They'd pitch the 7th, 8th, 9th, or at least the 8th and 9th. And La Russa's situation was, Eckersley, you got the 9th. That's all I want you to worry about. Focus on 3 outs every night. We're ahead. And it took him all the way to the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
Eckersley was kind of a mediocre starter. I think he made the All-Star team once or twice as a starter, and then became a Hall of Fame closer. So La Russa was ahead of his time. Dave Duncan was his pitching coach, and he had this big, thick notebook. And now it's all computerized, but he had this, he knew where, like, He kind of was a shift guy. They didn't shift the way they would shift now, but he was one of those guys that, well, this guy hits the ball here 78% of the time. We're going to shift that way, or at least shade that way a little bit. And they were one of the first groups to kind of do that. But that was all kind of handwritten. This big binder that
it was what they thought.
That's what they thought, and
it wasn't according to Watson or anything.
It was based on where the guys were hitting it. But now these computer guys, they just punch it in, and it just goes into this flow chart of data, and it's updated immediately. And the hot zones where this guy hits and where he doesn't, and where he swings and misses, and where you should pitch it. But Dave Duncan was doing all that stuff kind of by hand off tape back in the day. day. So LaRussa was kind of a fun guy, and that story about Fisk was kind of a fun one. We had him on the air one time, and we flat out asked him, like, do you think you should be in the Hall of Fame as a manager? Because remember, he was like a top draft pick and then blew out his knee, and he was a shortstop, and that's when the White Sox turned him into a coach. And then he managed the AAA team in Des Moines and then got promoted up to Chicago. So he wasn't going to get in as a player. And this was before he won the 06 World Series for the Cardinals, and then he eventually won the 11 World Series, and he had won one with the A's, so he's clearly in.
Hall of Fame.
But,
this was before
this
that,
would have been 2003, 4, 5, somewhere in there, where we asked him, do you think you'll be a Hall of Fame, get into the Hall of Fame? And he was pretty honest about it. He said, I think so, but if I can win one here with the Cardinals, and I think at the time only Sparky Anderson had won a World Series in both leagues, and I don't know if that's still the case. Since I moved and now I'm more into college sports, I don't follow the baseball thing as close as I do. I'm still paying $125 a year for MLB because
of course.
I thought I'd watch the Cardinals more when I moved here, and I just get auto renewed every April and forget to cancel it. It's
here's your reminder.
It's just like might as well burn $100 bill instead. But occasionally I'll flip on a game or whatever. Anyway, he said, we asked him, and he said, if I can win one here and win one in each league. And then we were in the basement studio. It was the old Busch Stadium, so it had to be 04, 05 because the new stadium opened in 06. And he stood up. We were just like this studio. He stood up. And he said, and he took a step to the left, and it was funny. He's like, I might be able to slide in, get in the side door. It was a little self-deprecating, meaning even if I win one in the National League, I'm one of only two guys to win one in each league. I don't think they're going to let me right through the front door.
Yeah.
And he stood up and acted it out. He goes, I think they'll takes a step, let me in the side door.
That's awesome.
And we're like, I think they will too.
Yeah.
And then, of course, he won it in 06. And then he won it again in 11, and that put
you're
it
due.
away.
You're due.
He's in. And then we had a funny story I had. So, like I said, up to that point in my career, when I moved here in 06 from St. Louis, LaRussa, I had interviewed him more than anybody by far in my career. Every home game, before and after the game, right? I interview him, just a quick 3-minute shot, whatever. And then Target Field opened in 2010, and the Cardinals came up here to play an exhibition game before the real season started, I think a day or two later. So it was a chilly day. Yeah. And I think Carpenter and Pujols might have been the only guys left from when I was there in 06, because this was like 4 years later. And I had not talked or seen Tony. I texted Tony after he won the 06 World Series. Never heard back from him. I'm sure he had 5 million texts, right?
Yeah, of course.
Never heard back, so I'm like, well, okay. And so now it's 2010. I don't even know if he remembers me at this point, right? I was there 5 years, but he had talked to 70,000 reporters over his time. So I go down on the field at Target Field, and he's down there, and I walk up to him, and he just looks up, and he's like, Grimm. I'm like, how you doing, Tony? Good. You want to come in and see the guys? And I'm like, Tony, I don't think there's anybody. I only, Albert and Carpenter, I think, are the only guys left. This was like 2010. Roland may have been there. I don't think so, though. And I said, no, I came down to talk to you. So we had a real good conversation, but I thought it was funny. They said, you want to come in and see the guys? I'm like, no, trust me, they don't want to talk to me.
No.
They don't want to talk to me. So that was in 2010. And then Target Field hosted the All-Star game in 2014. So Jacob and Isaac, your two friends, my son Jacob and his friend Isaac, and then another one of their friends and I went to the All-Star convention area at the convention center. And we're walking down just kind of the walkway. There's card shows and there's autographs and there's MLB had a bunch of different programs there, like guest speakers. Like they would have Hall of Famers come in and fans could go watch all this. They had a gift shop and all this. So we're just basically walking down this hallway in between all this stuff, and I look up, and LaRussa he's there.
Yeah.
And he's walking toward us. And now this is 2014, so this is 4 years after I had last seen him, and we had talked since, and it was it would have been 8 years since I left St. Louis, right, in 06. So now I'm like, there's no way now
he's remembers
he's going to
you.
remember.
Yeah.
So we're walking up, but I was going to go up and try to make eye contact, and same exact reaction. He looks, he goes, Grimm. I'm like, Tony, how you doing? Great. I'm like, you doing? He's like, yeah, I'm doing a presentation here. They're going to have me on. They're doing like a Sirius XM show, and people can come and sit. I said, well, great, we'll come and watch. And he's like, this your boy? and Jacob, my son, was there, but he had a Twins hat on. And I'm like, yeah, this is my son Jacob, this is his friend Isaac, his other friend Trevor, and they're all like, holy cow, like Tony La Russa, right?
So they're like, holy second
cats.
Winningest manager of all time.
And Tony then, in total La Russa fashion, can I swear?
Yeah, go ahead.
So he turns to Jacob and he's like, why are you wearing a fucking Twins hat?
Yeah.
And Jacob's just like what?
Yeah, he's like 14 years old.
Yeah. And I'm like, well, he has I said, Pujols is his favorite player, has a Cardinals hat, but we're in Minnesota, so
you got to go with it.
He's like, oh, so he's got a Pujols hat? I'm like, yeah. And he's like, oh, okay, that's good. And then we talked. I forget, we small talked, and those guys thought it was kind of funny. But it was, so that was pretty good. I haven't talked to him since then. We went to the program, and it was fine where he talked. And I remember thinking to myself, I wish I could be up there interviewing him, because I had been around him enough to ask more interesting questions.
Of course,
than
the person.
Yeah,
you start judging the people. Yeah.
I'm like, this guy, he's in from New York this weekend. He doesn't know that much about La Russa. And it was fine, but I think I would have had.
You would have had a
good
one.
About the fifth story for
sure.
Right? And some of these others, but anyway, La Russa was to me probably the most intriguing cat I've covered over the years.
Yeah. I also want to ask Minnesota legend Sid Hartman.
Yeah.
Your son told me to ask you this as well. Any stories? Because he's got to be one of the most notable.
No question. No question.
Minnesota.
First, I have huge respect for Sid, because he grinded literally until the very end. He died when he was 100, and he had a column in the newspaper that day. So just incredible work ethic. Just did not want to get beat with a story. Wanted to be the scoop. Which created some friction, frankly, amongst even his own coworkers at times at the newspaper.
Yeah.
Because he wanted the best story and he wanted the scoop. And more often than not, he got it because he just worked hard. I mean, there were legendary stories way before I got here. One of the Super Bowls, I think he followed Joe Namath into the shower to get an exclusive interview.
Yeah.
Like you're following a legend into the shower, all this stuff. So I do have two funny Sid stories. So I had just gotten here. It was my first year, 2006. And so I hadn't made a lot of, I'm only at Gopher games. And then I worked at the time, I still work for M&M, but at that time, I wasn't full-time. I was just kind of covering games and getting audio and doing interviews. And so the Rams, St. Louis Rams, were playing in 06. And it was just a couple days after Minnesota lost the bowl game to Texas Tech. They were ahead 31-7 in the third quarter and blew the game. And so I'm sitting there, and I get a text from someone within the athletic department. I'm at the game, the Vikings game, and sitting mostly with my St. Louis people, because part of why I wanted to go to that one was to catch up
with
I'm
everyone.
I'm only 3 months removed from working with some of these guys. And so we're sitting there, and I get this text from someone within the athletic department that said, hey, keep it under your hat, but we're going to let Coach Mason go. I'm like, oh, man. Now they had let Dan Munson go, the head coach of basketball. I was I had done 7 basketball broadcasts, and they fired the coach.
Yep.
So that was my first year. And now, a month
start.
later, they're firing the football coach. So pretty soon, word starts to leak out. Sid has it. Sid says, they're firing Glenn Mason. So the game's over, and we're all walking down the stairway from the press area at the Metrodome down to the locker room to do player interviews. I don't even remember who won. It was the Rams or Vikings. But the big story was Glenn Mason got fired.
Yeah.
And so Sid is maybe 20, and it's just a long row of reporters, and it's kind of a spiraling staircase down, 4 or 5, 6 flights, 4 or 5 floors down from the press box to the locker room. And all of a sudden I hear Sid. I can hear his voice, but I can't make out what he's saying. I'm like, what's he doing? What's he talking about? I look up. He's up there. He's pointing at me. Like there's 100 reporters there, and he's like, Grimm, you're a coach killer. You're a coach killer. You come to town, and they're all getting fired. And I'm just like, thanks, Sid. I don't think it's my fault, but okay. And so for a couple, it didn't stick, but a few of my friends locally in the media, when they'd see me, it'd say, oh, it's the coach killer.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So he was yelling down that I was the coach killer. Prior to that,
and that's pretty early in your relationship with him too,
I was here 2 months. That would have been January, maybe 3 months. I got here in late August, and that would have been December, late December, maybe even early January of the following year. But, within 3 months. But so the best Sid story I have for me, and I've told this a few times, I got into town in August of 06, and I knew of Sid because I had interned at CCO. Actually, had worked around Sid at some things, and I wouldn't expect him to remember me because he has all kinds of, he sees hundreds of people every day.
Every day, yeah.
I have that trouble some too. I'll see a lot of people, and they remember, me or Sid or whatever just because that's the Gopher guy, and then they'll come up. I'm like, hey man, how you doing? Yeah,
how's it going, buddy?
Got your name tag on or what have you. I'm better at it now. I really had to make a concerted effort to try to somehow remember something
names,
to trigger names, and I'm better now, but not perfect. Anyway, so Sid, I got introduced to Sid at Football Media Day in 06 in August. I got to town. Dave Mona, who was part of our broadcast crew my first handful of years here, awesome dude. Really a historian of sports, hosted the Sports Huddle for years on CCO.
Yeah.
And so Dave introduced me to Sid at the media day. And I had only met Dave that day, Dave Mona. And Dave was so nice. He's taking me around to meet all these people, athletic directors and coaches and players, and here at Sid. And Sid was about half interested, as typical for Sid, because Sid wisely really devoted his time to being friends with people who could help him, right, with stories. And the Gopher brand new pregame host,
you have no
36-year-old. At that point, I'm not going to help Sid much. So he was half interested. Hey, how you doing? We shook hands. Then at that time, I can't remember if it was Monday or Tuesday. I think every Tuesday, Mason then would have his press conferences on campus. And at that time, they would serve a nice media meal. So we would get there. We'd have pizza or spaghetti or something that they would serve. And then we'd go into the media room, and Mason would talk, and then some players would get brought in. And so the first week, we're sitting there. It's Mike Max and Dave Mona and me and Sid and some others. And Dave Mona again says, "You remember Mike?" "Yeah. Hey, how you doing?" "Good, good." And this happened 2 or 3 weeks in a row. That he couldn't remember me, but Dave Mona.
Say, "This is Mike."
Here's Mike. Oh, yeah. So about 4 weeks in, there was a discussion, and there's a little inside ball here, but there was a discussion about Sid was still using that old tape recorder, like cassette tape recorder, and digital was kind of coming into vogue there. So it's a long story, but there was some discussion that maybe Sid shouldn't either do the interview or have to get a digital recorder for the sound quality and easier to edit.
Yeah.
Because with the cassette, because Sid, what always would happen is we had like a 5 to 6 minute window in the pregame show, and Sid would interview Mason for the pregame show, but he would go 20 minutes.
Yeah.
And on cassette, that is a real hard thing to edit with digital. So there were some phone calls made, and Sid took it personally that they were trying to get him off the interview with Mason, and he was pissed off about it. And I knew none of this at the time.
Yeah.
So about 5 weeks into the season, I'm sitting there. There's one open seat next to me, and the rest of the table is full. And again, it's Mike Max, it's Dave Mona, Dave Lee, who was the voice of the Gophers then and eventually was the voice of St. Thomas. And now he's happily retired. I think he's doing some podcasting. Another just beautiful person, great guy. And some others. I think a guy from TCF Bank. And the one seat is left next to the new guy. No one's going to sit next to the new guy. So Sid gets there late. He gets his bowl of spaghetti and sits down next to me. And we would do the Glenn Mason show on Monday nights. Mike Max and I would co-host it. So this is a long story, but I think the punchline, we get there, it'll be worth the wait. And so Sid looks over to Maxie and says, "Hey, how was the show last night?" Because Sid would usually come to the show, but for whatever reason that night he didn't.
Yeah.
And Mike Max says, "That was a fine show. It's a coach's show." And then Max looks at me and says, "What'd you think?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I thought it was a good show. It was fine. It was great." And Sid goes, "What, do you work for Learfield or something?" And I said, and so everyone is, and Dave Mona, who's introduced me to Sid 5 weeks in a row, is now going, "Oh, brother, here we go." And so Sid's like, "Whoa, good, I need to talk to somebody from Learfield." I'm like, "Okay, yeah, what do you got?" And so he goes into this long rant about, "I don't need a digital recorder. Someone's trying to get me off that interview. I'll tell you one thing. The only reason Mason does that interview is because I do it. He wouldn't do it for anybody else. Good luck trying to sell a sponsorship to that without me on there." Sid. This is all what makes Sid endearing, right? This is not a knock on him. This is just how Sid was. And it's the only reason, they're not going to get a sponsor if someone else does it. And besides, who would they get to do it? This new kid, this goddamn Grimm guy? And I
And
look
he's
at
talking
him,
to
he's
you?
talking to me.
That's awesome.
And I've been introduced to him 5 weeks in a row. And so everyone's like, oh, brother. And I loved it. I'm like, I'm going to tell this story on a podcast 15 years from now. And so I turned to him. He goes, who are they going to get to do this? This new guy, this goddamn Grimm guy? And I go, well, I'm Grimm. And he goes, you're Grimm? I'm like, I'm Grimm. No offense. That was it.
That's perfect.
That was it. So Dave Mona, I'll see him not as much now, but a handful of times a year, and we'll always giggle about that story.
Yeah, you're that goddamn Grimm guy.
I'm that goddamn Grimm kid, is what he said, and he had no idea, even though he had been introduced to me like 5 weeks in a row.
Yeah.
Oh, you're Grimm? Yeah. No offense. It was great.
That's perfect.
So that's my Sid story.
Yeah. Well, we've been through a lot. My final question that I ask everyone, sometimes it's the easiest question for people, other time the hardest. What's your favorite movie?
Oh, favorite movie is A Few Good Men.
Oh, classic.
Have you seen it?
Yes, I've seen it.
Yeah.
I had to read the play in high school,
Oh.
and then I watched the Tom Cruise.
I think it's brilliantly acted. It's well written. There are a few flaws in it that, like
every
it
movie.
could go different. But that's probably it. If I had to sit down and watch a movie, and I did just watch it, Jacob, my son, who he had not seen it. So I'm going to say right before Christmas we sat down and watched it, and he gave it a thumbs up. I don't think he liked it as much as I did, but he also didn't hate it. He and other friends then watched it based on his recommendation after that. But so A Few Good Men, I would say, is my favorite movie. Jacob and my daughter were born in 2000 and 2001. So anything after that, I don't know much, because once you have kids, your movie life is over unless it's Finding Nemo or Frozen or whatever.
Which are great movies, of course.
Yeah, they're fine.
Yeah.
Finding Nemo was fine. There were others. Now, the later ones like Frozen, our kids were too old. I haven't seen those. But so any like classical or like all-time favorite movie for me would almost certainly have to be pre-2001.
Yeah.
So I think A Few Good Men is about 92 or 3.
Yeah.
So that's it.
Yeah.
Jack Nicholson was brilliant. Demi Moore was great. The guy that played Hankinson, I forget his real name, was great. Cruise is always good. I know he rubs people the wrong way, but he's a brilliant actor. And he's one of the guys that can carry different roles. Like sometimes you get pigeonholed. Like if you're so good at a certain role, you're only identified with that role, and it's hard. But Cruise has played everything. Everything.
He's
He
impressive.
He's been good, and he was great in that movie. And that courtroom scene. Now there's YouTube videos where that courtroom scene, where you go to the code red. Not spoiler alert.
I think you could
where it's
handle
like a
spoilers.
6 or 8 minute. Just that 6 or 8 is one of the greatest scenes in movie history.
Movie history, yeah.
I'll bet 5 times a year, 6 times a year, once every few months. I'll go onto YouTube just to watch that 6 or 8 minute stretch of.
Yeah,
of
you
acting.
just stumble upon it.
Just stumble upon it. And because you're right, because once you watch it, then it's always in that little list of stuff to the right. I'm going to watch it.
Yeah,
Click
why
on it.
not?
Yeah,
Why
exactly.
not? Yeah.
So A Few Good Men. I have other favorites, but that I think is number one.
That's the top. Yeah. Well, it's a classic, and I think this has been a classic podcast.
I hope so. I enjoyed it. Thank you. And good luck with all of your stuff too. I'm glad to be on. It was an honor.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining, taking the time, and we appreciate it.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Perfect.